Hello, good evening. My name is Drinka Stahuljak. I'm professor of French and Comparative Literature here at UCLA and director of the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies. It is my pleasure to welcome you this evening. The center, I want to say a few words about the center and about the event tonight. The center promotes and sustains transdisciplinary studies of the period from late antiquity to the early modern era. And since 2019, CMRS's interests spatially cover the globe, making connections between Europe that are true to the time period under our coverage, from Africa to the Pacific Rim to the East and Southeast Asia. And even though we at the CMRS embrace the globe, we are very mindful of our on-site connections and relationships in these virtual times. This is why this academic year, we are holding a new book salon program aimed at fostering intellectual community by engaging faculty authors about their recently published books. I am very pleased that we feature this year colleagues who have arrived to UCLA more recently as a way of getting to know them, especially while this in-person exile from each other continues. Our last book salon will take place on May 19th with Domenico Ingenito of the Near Eastern Languages and Cultures Department, though we will also host a talk on Indian dance and medieval studies on April 28th with Anurima Banerjee, who is faculty at World Arts and Cultures Dance Department here at UCLA, an event that is inspired by her recent book. Now, following on our first salon held in December on intimacy, it seemed inevitable that we would swing to its opposite. Tonight's salon centers on Andrea Moudarres' book, The Enemy in Italian Renaissance Epic, Images of Hostility from Dante to Tasso, published in 2019. And I hope that our two speakers, Professor Moudarres and Professor Gerry Milligan, will lead us gently from intimacy to hostility. Andrea Moudarres is Associate Professor of Italian and Vice Chair of Undergraduate Studies in the new Department of European Languages and Transcultural Studies at UCLA. He received the Aldo and Jean Scaglione Publication Award for his book manuscript from the MLA. His research interests include Renaissance epic, Dante, humanism, Machiavelli, and the presence of classical literature in medieval and early modern culture. He is co-editor of 2 volumes of collected essays, New Worlds and the Italian Renaissance, and Luigi Pulci in Renaissance Florence and Beyond. And he has just co-edited the special issue on the human-animal bind for the Journal of California Italian Studies. Gerry Milligan is professor of Italian at the CUNY Graduate Center and at the College of Staten Island, where he also serves as director of honors programs. His research focuses broadly on gendered identity in Italian Renaissance literature, in particular, the rhetorical construction of effeminacy and masculinity. His books include a volume of essays co-edited with Jane Tylus, The Poetics of Masculinity in Early Modern Italy and Spain, and the monograph Moral Combat, Women, Gender, and War in Italian Renaissance Literature, published in 2018. And he is also podcast host on the Italian Studies channel of the New Books Network, where Andrea Moudarres is featured. So here we all gather again. Thank you both, and I will hand it over to you now, and welcome to everyone.
Thank you, Stranka, for the introduction. And I want to thank UCLA's Center for Intermedieval and Renaissance Studies for the invitation, and to Erin, who's a spectacular coordinator. She's been very efficient. I guess you all know this, but it's been great. And I want to start out, this is, as you mentioned, not my first conversation with Andrea, and I'm really happy to be here again because I really love the book. And I know I'm supposed to say that, but I actually mean that. And it's just been a wonderful chance to not only read the book, but to get to hear Andrea speak about it. So we'll get to the reasons I really like it, but I do want to say a few things about it for those of you who haven't read it yet, that the structure is essentially chronological, which is covering a whopping 3 centuries, which is already impressive. And it moves in some ways from a micro to a macro sense of enemy. But Andrea, one of the things that I like that you do is in your discussion of epic is that you do two things, is that you approach the canonical texts and authors that we all know, Dante's Inferno, Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, and Torquato Tasso's Gerusalemme Liberata, but you also introduce some people to a text that they probably don't know, which is Luigi Pulci's Morgante. And those are some of the reasons that I like it. But what I wanted to get, the first question I guess I have for you is about the theme of the book, which is enemies. So sorry, Trinka, if I didn't go soft enough from intimacy to enemy, but I think the enemy question is central to the book. So you spend a lot of time in the introduction unpacking this notion of what an enemy is. And in fact, it's something that you really brought to my attention in a way. And you spend some time working between the words hostis and inimicus. And would you want to maybe walk us through the difference of these two words and how you see them maybe converging, and maybe how it just informs your book in general?
Thank you, Gerry, and thank you for Drinka and Aaron for organizing this, for inviting me to speak here, and of course everybody for being here on a Wednesday afternoon, Wednesday evening, especially for Gerry who's in New York. So the question of distinction between hostis and inimicus sort of underpins the main argument of my book, which is that the vast majority of conflicts depicted in the poems that I discuss in my book are actually endogenous. So these are conflicts that emerge from within the political or religious bodies depicted in the poems that I consider, and so this kind of goes against the sort of traditional distinction between hostis and inimicus, where hostis traditionally defines the public enemy. So that is the sovereign state against which another state can declare war, can wage a war, as opposed to inimicus, which is a private form of enmity. Competitor, I mean, the key text for this distinction is Cicero's De Officiis, who outlines this distinction in a section of the book dedicated to justice. And so what I challenge in the book is that this distinction actually holds ground, and that, as a matter of fact, when one examines Latin texts, so even Cicero himself occasionally betrays this distinction that he draws in the De Officiis, and uses hostis in ways that are not consistent with what he describes in the De Officiis. And a number of canonical authors, from Virgil to Seneca in classical antiquity, and then in the sort of transition from the late Middle Ages to the humanistic period, this habit of blurring the difference between hostis and inimicus continues in the works of such writers as Boccaccio, Salutati, Bruni, Alberti, etc. So the list goes on. So the book really tries to address this distinction, the problems inherent in this distinction, and tries to articulate a discourse about these four long epic poems that one could have a discussion about what epic means in this context. But that I consider to say. And so I guess the overarching argument is that all conflicts, including those between Christians and Muslims in these poems, really stem from an endogenous process. And so Muslims too are viewed as sort of renegade Christians in of course in the Divine Comedy, with the depiction of Muhammad among the schismatics in Inferno 28, and also in different forms with Torquato Tasso's Gerusalemme Liberata.
Well, and this is the really, I think that the hook that really gets the reader into your book, that immediately you have this really nice turn of phrase where I'm going to quote it here, I wrote it down. In the Italian Renaissance epic, to know thyself also means to know thine enemy. where the enemy is the self, and that seems very clear in your discussion with Orlando Furioso, and where the self and one's own psyche becomes the enemy. But let's go back to Dante, since you mentioned it. And this is a really fascinating read you do. With the enemy, the Muslim enemy being part of sort of a renegade Christian, as you say. But you tie it into fathers and sons. So, why don't explain how you do that? That's a really interesting move that you make.
Okay, thank you. So so Kento 28, just to give a little context, is dedicated to those who sow discord within political or religious entities, right? And it's a gallery of characters, and the punishments are gruesome. The depiction of Muhammad is disturbing and offensive, but it's sort of the punishments literalize divisions within political religious bodies, right? And the key, and Muhammad is included among this because he severed the mystical body of the church. There were numerous legends of Muhammad being a Christian cardinal who, since he was not made pope, he created a different sect that went against Christianity. So there are numerous variations on this theme, but they have in common is that Muhammad was a Christian. And as Dante channels this tradition, how does that relate to the question of father and son? Well, the main point of contention, theological point of contention between Christian theology and Islam was considered to be Islam's refusal to accept Christ's divine nature. They only thought that it was a human being. And so theologians who in the Middle Ages discussed the tension and the conflicts and the differences between Islam and Christianity often saw Muhammad as a divider of the father from the son, insofar as they did not acknowledge that Christ was the second person of the Trinity. And so that's how Muhammad fits into this discussion, which then culminates at the end of Inferno 28 with Dante's depiction of the Provençal poet Bertrand de Born, who sowed divisions between Henry II and his son, nicknamed the Young King. And the Young King died as a result of the conflict between them. And Dante punishes Bertrand de Born by having Bertrand de Born carry his head like a lantern. That's a famous depiction.
Which, of course, has a little bit of resonance with your book cover. Right. Which I've been looking at the book cover. The detail of the book cover is so nice. It's Caravaggio's decapitation of David and Goliath. But the way the detail works is it takes a lot of the violence out, but it actually, I was thinking about this as I was looking at it, it actually makes Goliath somewhat sympathetic. And I was wondering, in some ways, the small figure David who kills the large figure Goliath is a theme that you have in your in chapters really 2. The next chapter about Pulci, with Pulci's the Morgante's a giant who's killed by a little crab, and it's a theme that sort of traces, because you trace Hercules through the next 3 chapters. And I often wonder where our sympathies are supposed to lie, because are they to lie with the crab, or are they to lie with Morgante, or they lie with the crab or with Hercules? And we're supposed to be sympathetic with David, but this is a very sympathetic Goliath. I mean, his little eye is very sad. So I think it's, I don't know if you want to talk about, if you've even thought about the cover that much. I know your control of a cover is not that much a publisher, but.
Thank you for bringing this up, because my initial reaction to the book cover, which was proposed, I had to acknowledge my publisher, left me a little perplexed at first. So it took me a while to process it and accept that I think it looks good, but that my opinion of that counts very little.
Yeah.
But my initial, I don't want this to be so violent in the cover. But then it turns out that the book, actually the introduction of the book begins with images of decapitation. So it was actually the perfect cover for the book. Now I should gloss here, noting that I'm a peace-loving guy. I do not favor conflicts over peaceful resolutions of disagreements. But it turns out that the cover was successful. And I think it's eye-catching, and I'm not sure whether we're supposed to sympathize with Goliath or the sort of figures of Goliath among the enemies that we discussed. I mean,
probably not, but in the enemies that we discussed, and I guess this brings us to your actual book, which is the Hercules / Morgante, or Hercules Orlando, versus the little figure which ends up being their demise. I mean, you're talking about enemies in the Pulci, and you show how the enemy is internal. I mean, why don't you can tell us how is there an internal enemy in Pulci? How do you read that?
I guess he reads sort of metaphorically in terms of the venom that consumes Morgante in the episode of Morgante's death. So just a quick note: Pulci's Morgante deals. The title character is this giant who performs sort of bombastic exploits. Is a sympathetic, rascal, scoundrel-like character, but we end up loving it by Kento 10, and he's killed by the bite of this small crab. Okay, and I mean there's a discussion of the etymology of the word crab, which in Latin is cancer, which has obvious medical ramifications, and this is sort of the metaphorical, and this was viewed by already has been read as an indication of treachery. So as sort of crabs were considered to be allegories of treacheries. They were considered traitorous animals, and so then projected onto the historic discourse, which deeply affects Pulci's Morgante, especially the last 5 cantos of the poem, which were written after this famous episode in Florentine history, which is the Pazzi conspiracy, in which a group of conspirators tried to assassinate Lorenzo and Giuliano de' Medici, who were, to all practical effects, the rulers of the city, despite its Republican institutional profile. And so the sort of the question of the internal enemy is articulated in that chapter as, on the one hand, a question of treachery. So someone whom you trust, who turns against you and challenges your power, and how even someone who's very powerful can be exposed to the insidiousness of that threat. And then, so in the second half of the chapter, I deal more sort of directly with the question of the Pazzi conspiracy. It's only a few pages that are dedicated to that, but clearly Pulci has that in mind. And it's so whereas the first 23 canti or cantari of the Morgante, sort of the comical aspect is more prevalent. In the last 5 cantari, they're more dramatic, culminating with the death of Orlando and the ferocious vengeance by Charlemagne against the Muslims who after, as a result of Ganelon's treachery, end up killing Orlando. So there's a shift in tone and a bit of substance in between the first part of the poem and then the last 5 canti.
And that little crab also, of course, bites Hercules, and you tie that so nicely into your discussion of Orlando in the Furioso. So really in the Furioso, that it's a moment where I think even those of us who hadn't read your book could understand, the enemy is yourself, because you are the madness of Orlando, right? It's his own psyche. But you take this in a different direction than I think most people, and that is to discuss Orlando as a tyrant. So why don't you tell us? I mean, I'm interested in this reading in particular because it's one that I hadn't considered. So tell us, walk us through how Orlando becomes the tyrant.
I mean, so this is probably the most difficult argument for me, perhaps the one that I was least successful at making in the book, the chapter. I have to confess.
I'm not saying that.
But the idea is not that you have to calibrate what I say, because Orlando is a lot of things in the Furioso. Is a parody of the lovesick patriarchal lover. Actually, he ends up losing his mind in part because he reads too much love poetry, sort of carved on the bark of the trees near where Angelica and Medoro consummate their union. And it's, you know, it's read as a sort of, Orlando is also read as the avatar of an older understanding of the hero, which is sort of substituted and kind of erased by emergence of different technology. And within the poem, it's sort of then the arch hero becomes the convert Christian, Muslim, then Christian Ruggiero. But I think it's also the character of Orlando is also viewed as a criticism of humanism and theories of humanistic education. That's the argument, part of the argument that Albert Ascoli makes in his you know, at this point, classic book on the Orlando Furioso. But I wanted to sort of articulate a political reading that took into account the parallel between Orlando and Hercules, and particularly in the relation between Orlando and the Senecan tragedy that gives the title, that provides inspiration for Ariosto's poem style, which is the Hercules Furens, in which Hercules, it's impossible to miss that Orlando Furioso is a sort of a reproduction in the title of the Seneca's Hercules Furens. And so in the Hercules Furens, Seneca depicts Hercules as this tyrant slayer who in turn adopts the same violence of his enemy and turns against his own family. So in the Hercules Furens, Hercules kills his wife and children. And the language that Seneca uses to describe Hercules in the tragedy is sort of plays sort of consistently on the parallel between Hercules and his foes, and so I mean it's almost I mean in the introduction I described it as a hall of mirrors where you see the image of Hercules constantly reflected in some of the lines that sort of pit Hercules against himself in the play. And so I see the consequences of Orlando's madness in the poem, the destructive consequences of his madness, insofar as he destroys the communities through which he roams, as an indication that in addition to all the other readings of Orlando as a character can be done in relation to Ariosto's poem, one can also read him as a possible allusion to the intrinsic danger of exercising power and to exercise it outside the control of reason. And so that's in a nutshell what I tried to say in that chapter. I mean,
I think you're going to get a lot of questions on it. I hope so, because I think it's so innovative. It's also one that I don't think that it's not that you're not successful. I think it's a new approach to Orlando's madness. But I want to bring up one argument that I think is extremely compelling and it's equally as innovative, and that is what you make about Tasso. And I really love this argument because I mean you make so many arguments about Tasso, and I'm going to skip them all just to say what I'm going to ask about. But and that is you discuss the conversion manqué of Armida, and you link that to this notion of conquest in the New World. And I just love this argument. I found it really compelling, and so I'm going to let you tell everyone about this. What's your process here?
Sure. So there are three main female characters in Tasso's Gerusalemme Liberata. One is Clorinda, who dies and converts before dying, and these two other characters. One is Herminia and Armida. And the scenes that are supposed to describe their conversions, I find deeply ambiguous. And I'm not persuaded that they convert at all. And especially with the case of Armida and this, so this supposed conversion is supposed to take place 6 stanzas before the end of the poem. Takes place she converts on a dime, sort of sport metaphors. She does so in a way that is inconsistent with her character in the previous, in the 19 3/4 of the poem that precedes that episode. And since that conversion is viewed by some readers as a way for Tasso to claim Christian European authority over the so-called New World, because Armida inhabits that space or occupies that space in a previous section of the poem, then I think one can sort of make an attempt to argue that, well, if she's not converting, I don't think we can assume that Tasso is also saying that Christians should militarily occupy the newly conquered, sort of newly colonized continents, especially sort of North and South America. I don't think that's, I don't think that argument holds water. And so that's what I tried. I see this as an inconsistency, and I try to highlight that in the chat.
Well, as I recall, you mentioned the method that they use is one of nonviolence.
Yeah. So I mean, I would need to go back to the previous chapter in which Armida who is in love and reciprocated by the main hero of the poem, who is this young man called Rinaldo. They end up absconding on an island in the Atlantic Ocean. In the previous version, it's actually in the Pacific Ocean. But in the revised version of the poem, it ends up being on the Atlantic. And 2 crusaders go and rescue him because he's needed in order to conquer Jerusalem, or liberate Jerusalem, whichever verb you want to use. And so they're explicitly advised not to use offensive weapons. So they can only use this magic wand that is an echo, by the way, of book 6 of the Aeneid, in which there's an explicit prescription not to use sword. And so this liberation, or this rescuing of Rinaldo from Armida's island is performed without the use of deadly weapons. And so I find that if that island stands for the colonized New World, then I don't think we can say that Tasso is suggesting that, yes, Europeans should just go and conquer and convert the populations of the world. I think that I just disagree with that reading.
So I think I have one last question before to lead to questions, or do not?
Maybe we want to just
Start questions.
Start the questions, because we're halfway into,
sure.
our hour. This has been great. So I invite everyone to please put your name in the chat. Don't raise the hand because we're over 2 screens here. So sometimes it's hard to track raised hands. Put your name in the chat, or write your name, write your question in the chat. But while we wait for you to collect your thoughts, I wanted to kind of follow up on this last discussion of Gerusalemme Liberata, because it's, one thing from sort of my medieval perspective has been, we have been, you're doing a move, kind of what you did in this last discussion is engaging with the world, right? How do we position literature, these poems, these epics in the world, and the move you're making about putting it more into towards the internal problems is kind of separating, let's say, Italy, putting it back onto itself, right? And a lot of what the work that's been done recently has been precisely to try to open up this more enclosed or encapsulated spaces onto the world, and the sort of the appearance of these topographies, different world topographies in text. So I just wanted to sort of have you reflect on that, Andrea, sort of the motivation behind doing what you did, and then we will turn to the other questions from the audience.
Thank you. I think part of I guess the part of the logic of that of my answer to your question is rooted in sort of one of the theoretical premises of the book, which is cosmopolitanism, and so and that relates to the sort of notion that it was espoused by many in Western Christendom of Catholic religion as a universal religion, as the etymology of Catholic suggests, right? And and following on that, on the idea that Islam was a Christian sect, or a sect that originated from the body of Christianity. And so it seems in those cantos dedicated to the excursions to the Canary Islands, which is where Armida's Island is, these questions of conversions emerge sort of forcefully. And so one of the questions that one of the two knights asks Fortune, which is the pilot of the boat on which the knights sailed to Armida's Island, is actually, well, what about all these people that inhabit these territories? Were they forgotten by God? They're not going to become Christians and they'll all be damned. And so, and Fortune sort of glosses over and says, well, no, someone will bring the faith. She mentions Columbus, very problematic, of course. But it's also, you're not supposed to know more than this. And so it's left open as a question for us as readers of Tasso's poem. It's also, one of the questions then becomes, what did Tasso know about the geographic explorations? What do you know about the literature concerning the colonization of the peoples of these sort of newly discovered territories? And so, Ferrara, which is where Tasso was, wrote his poem, spent most of his adult life, had a very deep interest in geographic exploration. So the library in Ferrara was, had a lot of material on that, and so it's not at all implausible that Tasso was well aware of the debates that were going on in the decades that preceded the composition of the Gerusalemme Liberata, of the debates concerning the status of the native populations of America. And so I think he sort of obliquely inserts himself in that debate.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think there's lots of evidence. I don't know for Ferrara, but there's obviously lots of evidence of the maps circulating in Italy for obvious reasons. Yeah. Not the least that they were the ones to whom we can thank for Portland charts, right? But yes, question from Bogna Pavlik. Would you be so kind as to comment during today's presentation if the Trecento tradition of oration had influenced the perception of enemies in the epic of Italian Renaissance?
It's a great question. I don't think so. I am not aware of it. It's hard to discern between sort of one, I guess, rhetorical so the study of rhetoric on the one hand, and then the sort of implementation of the use of language to describe enemies in epic poems. But I'm not aware of any obvious correlation between the two. It would be one thing that I think, I never said this in depth, but I think one thing that would be interesting to see would be to what word they use to describe enmity in orations. So do they use inimicus? Do they use hostis? In which context do they use each, etc.? So, but That's not part of my book. I didn't focus on that.
The question from Raphael Burns, who will ask it herself.
Yes, thanks, Andrea, for this presentation of your book. It's super interesting. I had a slightly broader question, maybe, about the sort of move to discuss epic through the lens of civil war, and sort of if there's a sort of internal contradiction there, or how that plays out in the text in terms of sort of civil war, in a sense, admits no heroes to the extent that everybody is sort of self-destroying and there are no heroes in it. So how can one have epic on the basis of a discussion which is about civil war? Mm-hmm. And then I have a second question, but maybe I can ask that afterwards.
You can go ahead. I'll try to.
Also, relatedly to that, in the context of discussions about Christian universalism, how this blurring of the boundaries between enemy and inimicus and hostis sort of aligns with a figure of Christ as the only possible hero. So, and a form of heroism which is based on the idea of self-annihilation. So it's in fact, even in the Crusades, the heroic act is not so much the killing of the enemy as it is the sacrifice of self. So that was sort of
good question. I mean, I think that even so to the first question, I think you can envision poems that can be considered epics, in which even though the conflict is internecine, has one side that is depicted as villainous, and the other side as heroic, with all the nuances that one, through the ambiguities that one can read in a hero. I mean, this is true. It's true for Aeneas, who is the proverbially pious hero, epitome of what a proper hero is supposed to be, but who is constantly fighting with his own propensity towards furor, right? Which is, manifested in a number of figures within Virgil's poem. It is probably it's a Lucan's civil war, which is where my book begins. That question of the hero or no anti-hero within a civil war emerges more prominently, and I mean, there is certainly an anti-hero in Lucan's poem, and that's Julius Caesar, and then Pompey is viewed as sort of to the extent that character manages to achieve that as a defender of the Republic, as does Cato, who, however, ends up playing a very problematic role in Book 9 of the Civil War, where he leads his, sort of Pompey's troops who survived after the defeat of Pompey against Caesar through the North African desert. And it's a depiction of Cato that is either ironic or somewhat disappointing, in that it's inflexible. It's sort of a caricature of the Stoic. I mean, it's so unambiguous, right? As for the second question about Christ, it's a great question. I'm not sure. I mean, that's a case where, I mean, I'm not the first one to say that, where defeat is victory. I mean, that's the source of salvation is in that, and is in death, and in the sort of refusal to use one's powers. I mean, Christ has superpowers, but he doesn't use them to defend himself. There's a passage in Kento 4 of Inferno, when Dante and Virgil arrive in Limbo, and Virgil describes Christ in ways that, sort of somewhat confusing ways, because Virgil cannot understand Christ, honestly, and he describes Christ as uno coronato di vittoria, right? So he confuses his Christ's crown of thorns with the laurel crown that was more familiar to him. I'm not sure how that idea of sort of a Christological idea of the hero applies to the protagonist of the poems that I discussed, but it's a very thought-provoking. So I got to think about it. I don't have a better answer now. Thank you.
So I'm going to ask Gerry to reflect on your book from his perspective, because of this, all of this enemy stuff and hostile stuff and violence and tyranny, just sort of to reflect on the gender questions of masculinity and effeminacy, and if that is at all playing out, perhaps, Andrea, not in your book, but in the subtext of your book. So I'm kind of hoping to put the two of you in conversation on Gerry's terrain. But maybe that's too hard, but it just occurred to me. We've been talking so much about these masculine issues, right? That it almost seemed obvious that I had to ask Gerry.
So the first thing I will say is that one of the reasons I so enjoyed reading Andrea's book is it opened my eyes to other ways of reading, because I'm always I have 2 eyes and 3 eyes on gender. And so this exact same scene, of course, seen through the eye of the internecine enemy versus gender is a fascinating way to consider it. So I have to say, and I don't mean this the wrong way, it's not that Andrea's book made me rethink notions of gender, though I don't want to say that. I don't want to say that yet, but I'm not ready to answer your question, I'm afraid. Andrea doesn't really consider, unless I'm missing something, Andrea, you don't really consider gender.
No, that's not a, I mean, it's not a key concept in my book. I think enmity could be applied to any category of characters. And so you can imagine inflecting sort of a discussion of enmity in terms of gender. I think that's perfectly doable.
And certainly I've considered these exact same characters through a different, but this isn't my book, this is Andrea's. So but in relation to enmity, I haven't. I have to think about it.
Okay. Next book.
Sorry.
That
Sorry
would be the next book. Jean-Claude Caron. Unmute yourself, Jean-Claude. Jean-Claude, you're muted.
You're still muted.
You're muted, Jean-Claude. Nope. And
I'm sorry. Okay, I thought you had to unmute me. I'm sorry. Andrea, I had sent a question that was just addressed to Andrea, and I think the point was to address it to you and to everybody. And reading it, I think it was a kind of incomplete or silly or complex. The point was more about the point of the book, this insistence or this trying to make all the conflict personal or individual versus public. It has anything to do with the question of the birth of individualism, which is kind of the cliche or the stereotype of the questions about 16th century. Is there confusion? What is the point? Why would that period not recognize an external enemy, or what is it all personalized? See, that's the kind of a very general question. I could not write it down in my text. Is it because the whole time was, even the time itself was unable to open to relativistic values outside of the European or the Christian context?
I mean, I would say, so to the extent that I know classical texts, it seems to me that the distinction between public and private forms of enmity is blurred already in classical antiquity, and so I don't think it's exclusive to the Renaissance. So that's and I think as I try to explain briefly in the introduction, that's what that's where the sort of, if you want to call it confusion, let's call it confusion between the idea of the public enemy and that of the individual enemy. That's where it comes from. Mm-hmm. If one had, if I had to identify a historical sort of connotation in why, and in Italy there is, or in the Italian cultural production of the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, there seems to be no clear distinction between public enemies and private enemies. Private enemies doesn't mean that it's just someone who has crossed you. It's a feud between families that then spiral into larger civic conflict, which is exactly what happened in a lot of places in Italy at the time, because there was no clear distinction between the public realm and the private, because the way politics worked at the time, where sort of personal affairs, family affairs were intertwined with the running of the state, with statecraft. And so it makes sense from a historical perspective that these sort of understanding of enmity be sort of foregrounded in Italian literary texts of the time. But to the extent that I know literature outside of the realms, outside the boundaries of medieval and Renaissance Italy, it seems to me that you can apply sort of similar you can question these categories in similar ways for other forms of cultural production. And so obviously I'm not competent to do that, but my hunch is that actually it could be done productively.
Would it be less obvious when there is a king, when the authority is more centralized, and of course the Italian family or the Italian family states, or that's very maybe understandable.
I mean, in the case of Bertrand de Born, for instance, he creates enmity between father and son.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah,
and that which, according to the fiction of the law, as Justinian describes it in his sort of reorganization of the Roman legal system, are one. So I mean, it's a literal. I mean, it's metaphorical, but then Dante literalizes this idea that Bertrand de Born severs a unity between the father, the king, and the son, which is what guarantees. It's sort of the idea of the king's two bodies, right? Where the dynastic lineage continues even at the death of the king, so that there is continuity in sovereignty.
So one more aspect. When would you say then this schemes doesn't work anymore?
I'm not sure. I mean, okay, so in the introduction, I mentioned two episodes of, let's call it, modern history. I mean, 20th century and early 21st century history. One is the war within the Second World War, is what happens in Italy after 1943, where the country is divided. And so there's an internal conflict among Italians, and at the same time, there's a larger conflict among sort of international powers. And so how do you neatly discriminate between internal and external enemies? I don't think that you can do that. And then the other example I use is that of Syria in the civil war that is, I don't know if it's, I guess it can be described as still ongoing, but where a domestic rebellion leads to the intervention of regional and global powers in one war theater. So how do you distinguish there between hostis and enemies when half of the people who are fighting are not even wearing uniforms?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So that I think, so that's why I think that this idea of sort of problematizing the distinction between hostis and enemies is productive. I mean, I'm also going against the traditional distinction between these two ideas put forward by Carl Schmitt in the German 20th century German jurist of the 20th century, where he sort of rearticulates this notion in the concept of the political. It's sort of, and he considers the sort of the enmity dynamic as the engine for the creation of political community. You cannot have a political community without an enemy, and so that's part of what I argue against.
In other words, the enemy, drawing the line could be just about anywhere. You could extend as far out or or pull it as close back in, right? But I think there's a way to say, even to my own question that I was asking, there's a way to say, well, the enemy is always private and public at the same time, right? So as far exterior as it is, wherever in the Canary Islands or who knows where in the world, as far exterior as it is, it might be very private, right? It might be already within, in a sense.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think we had a short question from Bogna Public following up about the need of personal expression of hatred. My previous question was related to my reading on Invectives by Petrarca. That was the first question, Andrea, on the Trecento orations.
It's a good question. I would need to go back and read those texts and see what words Petrarch used. I mean, whether he uses any word that indicates enmity, either inimicus or hostis, or some other term, adversarius or competitor, which are sort of sometimes used as synonyms in Latin texts.
Yes, and I think, thank you, Andrea, for that. I think Gerry, you might want
I just wanted to answer your question. But it was because Jean-Claude's question, I think, brought about a discussion that might get at what you asked, and that is that I think, again, my interest in this book is because there's a compulsion, of course, in the 16th century to other women from a men's perspective, and particularly even to feminize the enemy. So this is not I mean, Machiavelli talks about it, but it certainly happens in other places. And even in the same episodes that Andrea reads, women effeminize men, and there's a compulsion to remasculinize them, right? And so I was extending that to the notion of othering. If the male sort of subject is othering women, then there must be some expansion of that where they are othering the enemy. And Andrea's argument, which is so compelling, is to say, no, that's not what's happening, that it's all internal. That doesn't, I don't think, Andrea, I don't think you would, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how you, I guess the question is there ever a case where there is a true othering of the enemy? I mean, if Tasso is not doing it with Muslims, then maybe there never is an epic. But I think the other question I would have is, I mean, does that change the way we should look at gender relations? And that, of course, that hopefully it's not always seen as an enemy, but there is certainly this othering that's going on. At least it feels so. Almost a compulsion to define what women are and how they are different from men. So that gets to your question, I think, somewhat.
Yeah, thank you. Because I was less thinking about male, female relations than precisely the thing you just said, which is feminizing the enemy, feminizing the Muslim, sort of that kind of, and then remasculizing the Christian characters. If not, I mean, so that was really where I was going with that, so I wasn't necessarily talking about male-female relations. I was really talking about the gendering the other, or othering through gendering. Gerry, do you want to ask your last questions? I don't think we have any more questions.
No, I sort of just asked it, which was, is there ever a moment where we have an enemy who is actually the other, and is, at least that you're seeing in Renaissance epic, but maybe that's already been addressed, I think, in the discussion with Jean-Claude's question.
I mean, I don't think there is. But I don't know if there are sort of literary texts in which the othering is more explicit and foregrounded in a way there is no ambiguity between the internal and the external. I mean, I think, one would have to read a volume of literature that I don't think I have the capacity to absorb in a lifetime. But
this was not meant as a gotcha question. This was actually meant as a curiosity of how you see this.
I really don't. I mean, I really don't. At least insofar as I see, I guess the idea of cosmopolitanism sort of pushes us a little bit in that direction. I mean, if everybody is a member of one community, which happens to be global, then every conflict is in different ways an internal conflict.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly kind of the point that we could make today, right? I think this is why I was so thrilled, Andrea, when you accepted to talk to us in the New Book Salon, because I also thought your book, in perhaps understated but very clearly brought out ways, right at the end of this discussion, talks to our current moment, right? The enemy is everywhere, isn't it?
I don't think there is. Yeah, I don't think I need to sort of makes it more explicit how deeply, I mean, in our time, we see how the enemy is domestic. I mean,
that's exactly, it's in our bodies, it's like it couldn't be more internal than that, right?
Yeah.
And it's domestic. Yeah, absolutely. It's the enemy is everywhere. It's at home. It's no matter how far out it is, right? So, and how publicly this private enemy expresses him or herself or itself. Thank you, everyone. We have reached the end of our second New Book Salon. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your questions. And thank you above all to Gerry Milligan, who's joined us from the East Coast, and Andrea Moudarres from UCLA.
Thank you, guys. It's wonderful. Thank you all.
Thank you, Gerry.